Okay, this week, here we are, week 6, we're going to be talking about the evolution of a message. So, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is how artists have been viewed throughout history. We'll talk about how they started as craftsmen and then how they kind of became more this artist as individual that we'll see and is rebel against, kind of the system of how art was made. We talked briefly about this several weeks ago with the Academy and the French Salon, how there was this whole system of how art was being made, and that there were several artists who rejected that, and because of that, really, that's a big reason why we have a lot of the modern art that we have today. So let's go ahead and dive into this. So we're going to talk first about the artist as craftsman. So we're going way back to the time of antiquities, the Egyptians, the ancient Mesopotamians, all this ancient art that we're used to seeing. We want to be aware of this term called convention. So this is a standard way of doing things. It's, sets up specific expectations in the viewer and creates a common visual language shared by artists and viewers alike. So ancient Egyptian art is a really great example of a convention, because for the most part, even if you're not an art expert, you could tell if you were looking at an ancient Egyptian, hieroglyphics on the wall. We often see all these tiny hieroglyphics, right? So there's, this storytelling element or a proclamation or describing the scene. And we always have this kind of flattened, two-dimensional perspective. The characters are never looking at us straight on. They're always turned to the side. They're always angled, right? So there are certain conventions, rules that Egyptian art adheres to that helps us recognize what it is and how it works and operates in society. And the Egyptians were known for being very traditional. They were very steeped in their ways. There was a short time where there was a pharaoh who came in and he changed everything. He changed their polytheistic religion to just worshiping the sun god. He changed their artistic conventions. And then, of course, once he died, they abolished all that and went back to their old ways. But conventions are a very powerful thing. So staying on this, we can see that artists actually quite early on start breaking conventions. So Da Vinci here, he broke this convention by turning his figure in a three-quarter turned posture or profile. So instead of looking straight at us or seeing just her profile that we see in most Renaissance and earlier work, we see this kind of active pose. And while this wouldn't have been considered necessarily controversial, it was considered quite new at the time and innovative for him to do this. And we get this beautiful, this is his woman with an ermine, and she's interested in what's happening off the canvas. We kind of get this larger story that is going on, and it's really quite innovative that we see, but he's breaking these artistic conventions. So a lot of the conventions that we think of are these classical conventions, the work of the ancient Greeks and then the Romans, who basically copied most of what the Greeks were doing. And so when we say the word classical, we're just meaning of or relating to ancient Greek and Roman culture. This is the age of the classics, right? So we have what's called apprenticeships, and this is how it works. So it wasn't just for, if you were a stonemason or if you were a carpenter or whatever craft you worked in, whatever field you worked in, you worked under a master craftsman or professional, and you learned that trade. You were an apprentice to them. And so this is what we see even in the painting world. We see these big workshops set up, and we see a lot of artists develop their style underneath the master. So they basically learn to paint exactly like their masters. So early art history, most conventions were based upon the perfection of the human body. And though we lost these skills for a time during the Dark Ages and the Renaissance, it was really all about reclaiming these classical ideas. So there wasn't necessarily a ton of innovation beyond, we had, linear perspective, and we were recapturing these old techniques that we lost during the time of the plague. There were other things consuming our time and our energy and our thoughts. And so we see artistic tradition kind of break down for a while in history, and then we see it kind of rebuilt up. And this whole age of the classics is considered that high art. So by recreating this, it was this, proclamation of through culture that, hey, we're higher than, we've obtained, we're going back to this great grand, tradition, because we're now at a point in our culture where we can spend time dwelling and thinking on these things. We're successful enough, etc. So we want to be aware of the guild system. This is very much like the apprenticeship, just in organized fashion. So this is associations of artists and merchants that were set up to control the practice of a craft in a specific area. So guilds were often commissioned by the monarchy or the church to create art and architecture. So what we now call artists were referred to more generally as tradesmen or journeymen or craftsmen. They were really considered more day laborers. So the guys building these cathedrals, the guys doing the stained glass, all of this, we wouldn't have known the individual who created them, because they were craftsmen. They were part of these guilds. There were these organized systems. And the merchants really controlled the guilds because they wanted to control the craft. So if you came up with some innovative way to do stained glass, well, the heads of that guild were going to keep very tight secrets on that, because it was then gave you a competitive edge. And so these guilds, some of them were very successful. They became almost like secret societies as well. And we can see here an example from the year 1416 of a sculptor's workshop, and you can see kind of this guild in action. And there are arguments that while the guilds were set up to cultivate a skill, they often ended up stifling innovation and became corrupted by those rich merchants who ran them, because even when there were innovations and they kind of kept them hush-hush, they weren't able to share these trade secrets and these innovations with each other and bounce ideas off each other and grow and learn together as a greater, more general trade. And so it kind of stifled some of this innovation for a while. But with the Industrial Revolution and modernization, we have patents and copyright laws that forced a lot of these guilds to give up their trade secrets, and they became less and less relevant over time. And really what kind of was left over was these, kind of secret societies, like the stonemasons, etc., which really kind of started back with all these guilds. So a lot of early artists, these craftsmen, journeymen, tradesmen that we're talking about that worked in these apprenticeships and these guilds, they really relied on patrons and commissions. So a patron is a person who gives money and support to an artist or organization. So during the medieval era, artists worked for two main patrons. We had the church and we had the state or the courts. And this tradition lasted well into the 19th century. So everything that was being created really was for one of these two purposes or two entities, because frankly, they were the ones with the money. We didn't have that middle class yet, really, until, kind of the 18th, 19th century start to emerge and start spending money. So we have, these, that doesn't mean that we don't have, some that we're spending money on, some, general tapestries and fabrics and carpentry, furniture, all that kind of stuff. But it was really that very echelon, that upper class that was commissioning all of the artwork that we, kind of study in history today. And so a commission is just to give an order for or authorize the production of a project. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the church. So one thing that we see really beautifully done through the church is these illuminated manuscripts. So this is something that they commissioned, and a lot of it was done by monks in these monasteries. And we see texts that have been embellished with decoration, and in the Western tradition, these texts are typically biblical texts, and they're quote unquote illuminated with gold and silver detail by monks in these monasteries. So we see the Book of Kells, for example, which I was fortunate enough to see a really cool exhibition in Dublin at Trinity College when I was studying overseas, and beautiful, incredibly detailed. So there was kind of this active worship and, all this very fine, detailed. It was almost a ritualistic experience creating these and, kind of dwelling and meditating on the scripture. And there's tons of beautiful, beautiful patterns that reoccur. Certain saints are represented by different animals. Uh, just really beautiful stuff. And of course, they were very expensive to do and very time consuming. And so, it kind of played to the church's wealth and position to have this kind of work done. So let's move into the Renaissance a little bit, and we're used to this, this rebirth or revival that we believe happened in Europe during the 14th through the 16th centuries. It's kind of the Renaissance wasn't just this one aha moment that happened. It was really marking the transition from the medieval to the modern times. And I want you to watch this little clip if you click on the word Renaissance. And also you can watch one about the School of Athens as well. Which is a masterpiece by Raphael that is in the Vatican Museum in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And this clip that you're going to watch here kind of gives the argument that the Renaissance never really happened, and I think it's a very interesting perspective and quite true, to be honest, that it never happened in the way we associate it as happening, as being this aha moment and in history, and everyone knew that we were in the Renaissance and it was happening for everyone. So I don't want to say too much more because I want you to watch it and see what you think. Okay, let's go back and talk about the academies a little bit. We've talked briefly about them. So again, we have these schools or fraternities of master artists and artists in training, so these apprenticeships basically that were set up by the state to structure and control artistic production. And the first academies we see come from Italy, specifically Florence and Rome, and this inspired the French under Louis XVI to establish the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in 1648. And this kind of becomes, when Paris becomes the center of the art world, we see this very rich aristocracy, pouring loads of money into artistic production, very strict rules on getting into the academy, on how you create art in the academy. Women, there were very few female artists ever through the whole time that the academy kind of reigned that were included. And we were under this absolute monarchy. This was a form of government in which the ruler exercises ultimate authority, unrestricted by law. So we have this, beautiful bust by Bernini of Louis XVI, and he's saying, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. And he wasn't just the state; he was the church. He was everything. He had this absolute power, and so he controlled a lot of artistic production at this time. And so, yes, there was a lot of innovation under these academies, but they were also a bit stifled as well because you couldn't break the rules. You had to work in that context. And so while the academies controlled the majority of artistic production, they had this strict hierarchy when it came to subject matter in art. So a hierarchy, this is an arrangement or classification of things according to relative importance or inclusiveness. And at the very top of the food chain, the most important in this hierarchy of artistic production was Christian content. It was considered the most important, and therefore these paintings were usually the largest. We see these massive, massive oil paintings, like this one by Caravaggio, The Taking of Christ. And so this is when if you went back to, I believe it's the week 2 or maybe week 3 lecture, and we see that image of the academy and in these salons, and you see all the artwork all over the walls. Those massive scenes would have been Christian content. They also would have been history paintings. So this is Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon Crossing the Alps. So of course, this was commissioned by Napoleon. We see him being quite larger than life. He's kind of too big for this horse in a way. And we see, Hannibal was the first one to cross the Alps, and now we see Bonaparte's name kind of above that. He's on this gorgeous steed, kind of pointing to victory, where he really crossed the Alps on a donkey, and it was a very terrible, excruciating experience. but we see propaganda very early in paintings. And so we see these important historical moments, of course, through the lens of those who are dictating what's important. But this was kind of right below Christian content, was these history paintings. Next, we would have portraiture, but not just portraiture of anyone. It had to be portraiture of important people, like Vigée Lebrun's version of Marie Antoinette and her children. So this is a very large painting as well, very important because it was representing royalty, right? And actually one of her children died, and this is why the crib is empty here. Very interesting character. If you ever have a chance to study more about Marie Antoinette and her life, it's definitely worthwhile. So below portraiture, we have what's called genre paintings, and these would be scenes of, kind of everyday life or almost morality tales sometimes. If it was, people working the land, it was all for this moral purpose of, telling the story of hard work, or this is Jan Vermeer's The Love Letter. So this would be considered a genre scene that, this woman is, getting a love letter from her maid, is delivering it from, whoever it might be. And we're kind of this voyeuristic point of view, looking through and observing what's going on. And it's this very, Vermeer was a master of texture and light and color, and these kind of detailed scenes where we're kind of looking in. But this would be considered a genre scene. So this would be the next in importance under portraiture, of course, of important people. And then we would have landscapes. And then after landscapes, we would have still lifes. So these were the least important, but still lifes, they were commonly small paintings, with some exceptions being the Dutch and Flemish. They were masters of still lifes and celebrated this subject. And so we see these incredibly crisp, detailed, lifelike still life paintings, especially in what we have the Northern Renaissance, as well as we consider traditionally the Renaissance to be in Italy, right? But the Northern Renaissance would have been those Flemish kind of Dutch masters. And these would celebrate their wealth, basically, all the images. And sometimes they would have morality messages as well, these still lifes. But overall, still lifes were kind of the least important subject matter. So we want to be aware of that hierarchy of where, subjects laid in importance, because, of course, if you were a painter in the salon and you were an up-and-coming artist, would you want to just be painting the still lifes? No, they weren't considered that important in the academy. You'd want to be painting the portraits of royalty, the history paintings, the Christian content. And so that really dictated a lot of how artistic production went. We also want to talk about the Grand Tour. We have this cultural tour of Europe, formerly undertaken, especially in the 18th century, by a young man of the upper class as a part of his education. So these wealthy young men and women, often too, but mostly we see these young men, and they would travel all around Europe. So from England, a lot of them came from England and from France, and they would go down to Italy, sometimes to Greece, and they would do these artistic tours. They would see these important sites, important ruins. So this is the portrait of Francis Basset, who was the first Baron of Dunstonville, and Basset. And so he, is very posh here in his little outfit, and we can see ruins in the background, and it looks like he might possibly be in Rome. I mean, there's some kind of basilica in the background, and he's got a map and his cane and his hat, and so he's out studying the ancient world. So this was kind of early vacations, but kind of educational vacations, and they would be months and months long, sometimes years, that they would go on these grand tours. And a lot of these were young artists, aspiring artists. The French Academy did a competition every year where they would send one of these young artists to Rome to learn, the traditional classical style, because classicism was very popular, and we'll talk about that right now. So we have this guy named Johann Joachim Winckelmann, and he was known as the father of modern archaeology. Winckelmann is the first to classify the difference between Greek, Greco-Roman, and Roman art and architecture. And he wrote many books on this subject. His scholarship had major influence on this rise of neoclassicism that we see in the 18th century. He's a very flamboyant character, very serious guy, but he was actually homosexual as well, which is very not accepted at the time. But part of maybe why he was so fascinated with the art of the Greeks and the Romans, there was a lot of homoerotic art that went on in the age of classicism. And so kind of studying this perfect body, and there's just a lot going on there with Winckelmann, but really important character in the history of art, and getting us to kind of re-look at what was going on in the ancient world. And because of his writing and his scholarship, we see what's called neoclassicism, so new classicism. This is Western art, literature, music, and culture influenced from this classical cultures of Greece and Rome. So we see artists like Antonio Canova, who you would look at this and might think that this was, a Greek or Roman sculpture, but it was actually done in 1793, this Psyche revived by Love's Kiss. And so there was this, it was incredibly beautiful, elegant time in art, very balanced and moral in a way, but not in another way. But we see this reemergence of this classical style, and this was what was considered to be the creme de la creme at the time. So all the artists in the academy, they were all studying ancient sculptures, and even in their painting, trying to recapture this. We see Jacques-Louis David, for example, and you can watch a little video on this painting. Please do that. This is the Oath of the Hurati, and I believe that the clip does tell the story, but just to give you it in a nutshell, three brothers, the Hurati brothers, fight three brothers, the Curati brothers, who were at war, and they decided, okay, let's us three brothers versus you three brothers fight. Whoever wins, wins the war, and that way we don't have to shed any more blood of our people and our soldiers. And so this is the oath that the three Hurati brothers are swearing to their father to go and do this thing, that they will either die or they will come back victorious. Well, they end up coming back victorious, so they slayed the three Curati brothers. These are wives, and actually one of them is the sister. I believe it was this one here is the sister of the Hurati brothers, who was actually engaged to one of the Curati brothers, and she was so distraught that her fiance was killed that her brothers actually killed her because of her disloyalty. So very kind of not nice story, but a story all about loyalty to family, loyalty to the state, really. This was done kind of pre-French Revolution. Jacques-Louis David was a very careful guy. He kind of was able to go back and forth between sides. He, claimed this being, about being loyal to the throne, and then later, during the revolution, he was imprisoned for a little bit, but kind of was able to make himself a revolutionary, and this became, about being loyal to the revolution. But we see this very balanced, strong, they're dressed as Greeks or Romans. They're dressed really more Roman. We see the Roman architecture, and so even though this was done in 1784, we're looking back to these moments and kind of bringing them into the contemporary era, and this was really popular at the time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the artist as rebel. So we do see David being a little bit rebellious, just in a very under-the-cuff sort of way of kind of manipulating the state and the revolutionaries to kind of, keep his head on his shoulders. But let's talk about the Salon of the Refuse, the Salon de la Fusée. And this is, generally speaking, private exhibitions of artwork that were refused by the official Paris Salon that took place in art galleries around the city. So the most famous of these exhibitions took place in 1863, and it was an event sponsored by the French government, actually, because what happened is artists started exhibiting just, very little at first outside of the salon. Artists that weren't accepted to the academy, or that work wasn't, that were maybe used to be a part of the academy, but then wanted to do some different things with their work. And so these exhibitions start to gain popularity, and so the French government came in and said, well, if these are getting so popular, why don't we just take them over and sponsor them so that we can kind of control them a little bit and make some of the money off of them. And so this one in 1863 is the most infamous because this is when Manet exhibited this painting, Luncheon on the Grass. And this was in one of these, refused. This was refused by the traditional salon, but it was part of this Salon of the Refused. And so it was incredibly controversial, even for these refused paintings, because of its subject matter. We've talked a lot about this one already. So its subject matter, its overt nudity, or nakedness, I should say, over being a classical nude, the way he's manipulating space. There's just so much, and we went through this before, so go back over that lecture. I believe that is the lecture on context that we talked about this, and there's a link to this about this image, a little video for you to watch. So Manet was really important, though. He had guts, and he did this to kind of spite the salon and the traditions. And so we see artists starting to rebel. And so a lot of artists started following in Manet's footsteps, and we call these bohemians. This is a socially unconventional person, especially one who is involved in the arts. And we associate Paris especially with this romantic idea of bohemian artists, kind of living in Montmartre and being penniless and starving for their work. And that was partially true and partially not true, but it's a very romantic notion. And we did have this large bohemian class, and one of the reasons, to be honest, that they all moved to Montmartre, which is the hill in Paris where the Sacré-Cœur is built, but there wasn't a tax on alcohol there like there was in the rest of the city, or it was either there wasn't a tax or it was much lower. Also, the rent was a lot cheaper, so they could go and they could drink and be raucous and have these, big bohemian parties, and they could afford to live there. And so out of these salons of the refused, out of Manet's, guts, really, we have Impressionism in the 19th century that really comes about. There's a link here for you to watch a little bit about Impressionism. Oops, didn't want to actually go to it. And so this name Impressionism wasn't, it was kind of a derogatory term. It wasn't, this group of artists didn't call themselves the Impressionists initially. What happened is that artists like Monet, not to be confused with Manet, so we have Edward Manet, who painted, oh, it's not loading, this, and we have Claude Monet, who painted this, famous for the water lilies, all that good stuff. He painted a painting called Impression Sunrise, and it really was meant to be this, capturing this fleetingness of light, and that's what we can see here. The Impressionists often painted outdoors, and this was innovative as well to paint plein air, because we had technological developments where artists could take their paint in small tubes, and before it was, a lot more work to do that, to paint outside. So normally they would just do sketches and come back and work in the studio. But these Impressionist artists, they originated in Paris, and the style is characterized by expressive brushstrokes, very open compositions, an emphasis on light and color, and a depiction of everyday life. So Monet's Impression Sunrise was very kind of sketchy. Definitely look it up. It's a beautiful painting. Well, the critics said that's not a sunrise. That's just an impression of a sunrise. You're not really getting the detail. You're not capturing it, perfectly, crisply. And so this name Impressionism or Impressionists, they're just impressionists. They're not really artists. Kind of came about, but it ended up sticking, and so now this movement we know as Impressionism, and we call these artists Impressionists. And so we have Monet, Edgar Degas, Camille Pissarro, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Gustave Caillebotte, Berthe Morisot, Mary Cassatt, Frederic Bazille, Paul Cézanne, Alfred Sisley, and Armand Guillaumin, who were these artists who exhibited together and became known as the Impressionist artists. So while we might have other artists that may work in this style later on, we have the Neo-Impressionism that comes. We want to make sure that if we're calling a work of art Impressionist or it's Impressionism, it better be one of these artists, because if it's not considered a part of this historical moment and movement. So we can say something is after the style of the Impressionists or has impressionistic qualities, but again, unless it's created during this time period by one of these artists, we wouldn't be able to actually call it an Impressionist piece, if that makes sense. So go ahead and watch that clip. Enjoy. I think one of the reasons the Impressionist work is so well loved, because it is some of the most well loved art in the world, is because they kind of captured the world as we wish it looked. Who wouldn't want to, live in this inside these paintings, really? We very rarely see black in their paintings because black isn't really a color that's found out in the natural world so much. We see these, beautiful kind of, the light seems to kind of flicker and change, just like it does outside. If you're, underneath the trees and the sun is shining, and as the trees move, the light changes and moves and oscillates. So we see this represented in the work of the Impressionists. But we wouldn't really have had this work had these artists not had the guts to rebel against the salon and these traditional means of creating art. And we call this art that is considered new and innovative and experimental to be avant-garde. So this is art that pushes the boundaries. And so there's a link for you to watch about this. This is by André Derain, and we see these incredibly beautiful colors, arbitrary color, right? So these aren't colors that are necessarily relate to the natural world, but are a more emotional representation of the world and kind of the way this scene might feel. And so we see these avant-garde artists really start to emerge, even in commercial art. Art created for commercial purposes, primarily for advertising. We see artists like Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, who is the most iconic lithographic artist in Paris at this time, and he was the one doing all these beautiful advertisements, for the Moulin Rouge, for all these nightclubs, for these famous performers, and he really actually was influenced by the Japanese style. So kind of artists were starting to, the world was getting broader at this time, and so influences from other places were coming in, and these Japanese prints were coming in, and they would have these beautiful solid blocks of color that we see that, we don't necessarily have a lot of shading going on, just subtle to kind of separate her arm. But this is all kind of influenced by the Japanese style, and we can even see Divan Japonais up here. And so really beautiful. Le Chat Noir, the black cat, if you've seen that one, the famous posters of the Moulin Rouge. These were almost all done by Toulouse-Lautrec. So let's talk about modernism. So again, this is all about this kind of evolution of the message, right, and the artistic production and how artists were working. And modernism is a really important moment and movement. And I do teach a class all about modern art. So we're getting a very, very tiny, tiny bite of this term and what it means, because it's a very hard term to define. But this is the general definition that I'm going to give you. So we're looking at a broad movement in art and literature that constitutes a rejection with the conventions and traditions of the past. It is often characterized with experimental and avant-garde styles. The age of modernism also sees shifts in politics, in philosophy, in industry and the sciences. We have the Industrial Revolution, of course, including the development of the field of psychology, thanks largely to people like Sigmund Freud. And while the pre-modernist world is characterized by a sense of order and stability, rooted in the meaningful nature of faith, of collective social values, and a clear sense of identity, both personal and cultural. We see the church kind of being in power before this, the salon being in power, kind of having this strong, clear identity. The modernist period is really characterized by a sense of chaotic instability, rooted in the revelation that collective social values are not particularly meaningful, leading to faithlessness, skepticism, and a confused sense of identity. This is where the world starts to get a bit crazy. We have the American Revolution, we have the French Revolution, we have the Industrial Revolution. Everything starts to, the pace starts to pick up. Change is happening really fast. The lower classes are rising up, questioning these conventions and the social order that they believe needs to change. And so art is very often reflective of that and what is going on in the world. And so we see modernism really emerge, and we see artists rejecting the traditions of the past because they associated those with bondage in a way and how the world used to be, not just artistic tradition, but those artistic representations really kind of became symbols of the way the world was and that they thought wasn't working anymore. And so we have artists like Pablo Picasso, this painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, so the women of Avignon, this was women in a brothel. This was painted in 1907. I don't believe it was exhibited till around 1914 because it was so new and so controversial, and there's a link for you to watch about this painting. But it'll really help you kind of understand what Picasso was doing and what he was after. But this is really the age of experimentation, so artists rebelling and really then becoming an individual. And so we have these, finally, we have these kind of individual personalities that emerge as being kind of celebrities. It's not that artists like Da Vinci weren't very iconic, and Michelangelo, and even, you know, Jacques-Louis David, you know, these court painters that gained their own notoriety and fame. It really is in the 20th century, for the most part, that we see these kind of celebrity artists, and that the artist as individual becomes really important, reflecting on their inner self, the subconscious mind, you know, all the psychological innovations that Freud talked about. And so we see a lot of really interesting, innovative stuff coming out. Well, not everyone liked that. And in the 20th century, of course, we know one of the greatest fiascos of mankind happens, and the Holocaust occurs, and World War II. And of course, before that, we have World War I, where a lot of artists really rejected the system then and decided if life doesn't make sense, if the world doesn't make sense, why should art? Let's be absurd. Let's be nonsensical. Let's be chaotic. Let's really describe inner emotion. And in the 1930s, when the Nazi regime was, kind of building their power and their propaganda machine, they used artistic production as a really powerful tool to spread their message. And if you know at all about, if you studied this time period and know anything about Hitler, he actually was an art student and tried to get into the Vienna School of Art, and he was not accepted. He was a very mediocre painter, really. But I've always wondered, would things have unraveled the way they had he been accepted to art school and just, became a working artist? But there was this anger and he really, you see him really go after the modern artist. And there's a lot of personal stuff going on there, I think. So he creates this whole propaganda machine around art, and it's called Unterkunst, so it means degenerate art. And he let his propaganda guys basically go in, they were the heads of culture, right? And they went into all the exhibition spaces, the galleries, the museums in Germany, which at this time, the German expressionist artists who really took off in World War I in the 1920s, Germany almost became the center for modern art at this time. And so a lot of these museums had some really innovative stuff going on in them. Well, Hitler's guys went in and they basically confiscated over 16,000 works of art from these galleries, these museums, from artists themselves. And a lot of it they burned, but then a lot of it they put in this exhibition. And what they did is they designed it to make modern art look dangerous and destructive to culture. And there is a full documentary that obviously you don't have to watch it for this class. But it's an enrichment activity. But if you click on this, there should be a link. There it is. So if you click on this image, it will be a link to this documentary that's really good about this whole moment. So if it's something you're curious about, a few years ago, that film Monuments Men came out, had a lot to do with this subject. But they were kind of, art was hung kind of crooked on the walls, and there'd be these statements. This was created by a Jew. This was painted by a madman. See the inflation of this work. It was, our museums paid, thousands and thousands of dollars for it, and it was really about destroying modernism. And at the same time, Hitler went ahead and he was building a museum that was basically going to house his whole collection, which was this very kind of sterile, almost a little terrifying, almost neoclassic, but very German art that he believed was, represented this pure Aryan culture. And so there was, this was all designed this way on purpose. So let's destroy the modern art and tell the people that, this is horrible. And at the same time, but look, you can walk across the street and you can see the Great German Art Exhibition. And it was all about propagating their message, really. So we see a lot of modern artists struggle during this time. And so this is some examples of the type of images that they would put up side by side in the exhibition. So the message was that this art, and the individuals who created it should be shunned from society. Only true art was that which depicted the collective whole of the Aryan race. And so these are some iconic modern artists. And they would, put these images next to it, say, this is what they're painting, this is what they're depicting, these are the people that we need to get rid of in society, they bring us down, So it was a very ugly moment, as we know. But as a result of World War II, and as a result of Antarctica, which millions and millions of people went to see, and a lot of modern artists, they fled Europe because they had no choice, really, or they were stuck there and couldn't really create, or had to create underground, or it was just a big mess. But so a lot of them came to New York, and they brought their innovative styles with them, and this is the first time in the States that we really start to see some innovative modern styles, because, a lot of poor artists couldn't afford to, go over to Europe to study all this great modern art that was going on, and so they brought a lot of their styles over. And the first one we see is abstract expressionism. This is a movement that develops in New York post-World War II, characterized by a lack of figuration. So we mean there are no people, there are no objects present. This is completely non-representational. There's an emphasis on the psyche of the artist. More specifically, this is referred to as New York School abstract expressionism. And it is categorized by having two distinct styles. We have gestural and we have color field paintings. So we see gestural paintings here in the work of Jackson Pollock, and it means there's this, the gesture is really the most important part. We can imagine him standing over and dripping this paint and, moving around the canvas. He often put his canvases on the floor to work. So the artist's hand is very present in the work. There's this outpouring of emotion without figuration, right? It's a pure abstraction. And then we see on the color field side artists like Mark Rothko creating these very large canvases with these kind of buzzing, harmonious fields of color that were meant to be very meditative. And here's Jackson Pollock doing his iconic drip style. He's kind of the James Dean of the art world. And there's a link for you to watch, and I want you to make sure you watch it because this is a very important, iconic little piece of film. It's only about 10 minutes long or so. But you get to hear Pollock in his own words talking about this deeply personal method and what he was doing, and it's got some very strange experimental modern music going on. He paints on a piece of glass, and the camera is underneath the glass, so we get to see this process of what's happening. And so this really became, again, about the subconscious mind, about releasing that inner emotion and inner psyche, and A lot of people, have trouble with this kind of work, and well, how is that art? I don't get it. Well, if you ever stood in front of a Jackson Pollock, they're really beautiful. And if you think, oh gosh, I could do that, I've tried it. It's a lot harder than you think. Um, but again, you have to put it in historical context of what artists were reacting against, what they were trying to do. This art becomes deeply theoretical. And so it often, you have to look beyond the canvas into that kind of cultural sphere to understand this work. His paintings were very large. They were meant to, as you stood and looked at them, that they kind of engulfed your whole field of vision. But really cool stuff. So make sure that you watch this link about Jackson Pollock. And so by the 1960s, artists began to reject the strict formalism of abstract expressionism. And we say formalism because it was really strictly formal. And we say formal as in form, line, color, weight, unity, balance, all of these elements. So there's nothing else for us to really interpret as far as a subject matter, right? That we're supposed to, kind of have this pure experience with it. By the 1960s, artists began to reject this strict formalism, and they began to further experiment with new mediums, often combining seemingly disparate images, so images that didn't seem to go together at all, to create a message about the individual artist or society as a whole. And so we have artists like Robert Rauschenberg, and you can watch a link about him as well. And he created these, he called them combine paintings or photo collage or photo montage, but combine was kind of his term. And he often would take, other objects. There's a very famous one of his called Monogram with a goat standing on a painting with a tire around it. But it was about kind of telling a new story. Is what he was doing, and a lot of them were very politically charged. So go ahead and watch this link. So we have artists, now they're not just being commissioned and being told what subjects to paint, but they're the ones dictating what they want their art to be about and what they want their message to be. And these messages tend to be very powerful, and they reflect a lot about where we are as a culture. So the 1960s also saw a boom in the graphic arts, especially in the film industry, and the legacy of artists like Saul Bass, still very much felt today. So there's two links here. There's a link here, and there's a link here, and I want you to make sure you look at both of those. So these are just very few of the movie posters that Saul Bass designed. We have everything from West Side Story to Vertigo to Bunny Lake is Missing, really to Exodus. Really, really cool graphic work, and I believe it's this clip. Yes, that's actually the Catch Me If You Can title sequence. So if you remember the movie Catch Me If You Can with Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks, that whole title sequence is all based on the work of Saul Bass and his style. So graphic design, we're looking at an art of communication, stylizing, and problem solving through the use and of type and image. And Saul Bass was also known for some very iconic logos. And can you name any of these? He designed all of them. So his style and his work is still very much felt today in this very graphic style of communication. So now today, more than ever, there are unnumbered ways to send a message, right? So we've been talking about kind of this evolution of how artists send their message, that they started as craftsmen. They didn't really have individual identities. It was very much dictated by the church and the state what their message would be. Then we see them start to rebel. We see them start to work in innovative styles, to work with the subconscious mind, the inner human self, and letting that out. And then kind of being the ones to promote certain ideas and messages and theologies, etc., etc., etc. So now today, and this is just a little chart that I found that has all of these, methods of, communicating. And I want you to consider how these new modes of information delivery may or may not have changed the way we understand the world. What type of new media do you find the most exciting? Does the method of delivery change the message at all? And how, as Christians, can we use new media platforms to spread the gospel to a 21st century world? So I want you to kind of look at that, brief history of, communicating in the arts, and what can I take away from this? What can I use? Why is this important to be aware of? And how can we really, spread the message of the gospel? So that's that. Enjoy and have a wonderful, wonderful week.